Well, good evening and welcome to our 30th session for the book of Deuteronomy. Actually, this is my second take because the first take I said welcome to our study in the book of the Revelation. We stayed in the book of Revelation for a long time. We're actually going to stay in Deuteronomy probably as long, if not longer, because it's a great book, a foundational book. And if you're just joining us, it is one of those documents that, it just lays a foundation for everything. And this is God laying the foundation for the nation of Israel. And so we're in chapter 6. We just moved through what was called the Shema, which many people are very familiar with that passage. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And it talks about how we're to, teach the coming generation about God, how we're to pass on the faith. And so moving from that directive from God to pass on the faith and to stay faithful, then God begins to tell the people of Israel in verses 10 through 25, and we'll probably only get through maybe verses 10 through 19 today, of how they are to carry out this command. And of course the command, let me just read it to you from verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And so God gives a command, but what he's going to do next, and what we'll study today, is God's going to tell them how to do this and how to accomplish this. And so it's not just some nebulous theological theory that he's giving them. He actually gives them very concrete ways to keep this word and to honor him, and ways not to do that. Reading on, verse 6 says, and these are the words which I command you today, this shall be in your heart. And so it starts there. It starts in the heart. It's not just an outward, demonstration. It's something that is on the inside first, and then the outward. You shall teach them diligently to your children, when you shall talk of them, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And so God is saying these words, this command, is to be your entire life. It's not just a part of your life. It's not just a part of your identity. It's your entire life. It's from morning to evening. It's every part of you. It's about your whole existence. And people should identify you with this. And so we come to verse 10, where God begins to tell them how to do this. It's the practical application step, as we can say. And so here in verses 10 and 11, we see examples of faithfulness. And God reminds them, he begins to give them a little bit of a history lesson as well, and also is going to give them some perspective about what he's giving to them. So listen to what he tells them in verses 10 and 11. So it shall be, when the Lord your God brings you, so this isn't their effort, this is the Lord doing this, when he brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers. So this is a history lesson here. That he started this 400 and something years ago, long time ago. And God is, even though we've kind of taken a circuitous route through Egypt, God is still faithful and still keeps his word. There were many people who died in Egypt. 400 years, there's a lot of generations that come and go in 400 years, who never knew freedom. They knew the promise of freedom. They knew that one day freedom would come and that God would honor his word, and they trusted the Lord, but they lived in slavery and they died in slavery. So here God is fulfilling this. He said, I swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities, which you did not build, houses full of all good things. Now, he's reminding us, it's not that they're going to do this. They're going to go there and have these things. They're going to walk into the land and it's just there. These houses will be there waiting for them. These cities are already built. Houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. And when you have eaten and are full, and I'm going to stop right there because God is about to shift gears on them. And, so he's saying, I'm going to load you down with good things. You're about to go in and you're going to be amazed at all the things that I've got for you and that you're going to enjoy. So here we see God is giving them an example of faithfulness. Their fathers were faithful to God. They believed the promise. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had to leave the promised land and go into Egypt. He died in Egypt. And so all of his his sons and daughters and their sons and daughters and on and on and on for 400 years, lived under the promise but never inherited it. They never saw the promised land. But God is faithful. And so God is showing them a contrast here between them, these people who are about to be blessed, and those who lived under the promise and yet never inherited it, but they prepared the way for their children's children's children. And so here we see a contrast between those, the fathers and mothers, and those who are inheriting the land. And that it is God that is bringing them out. They didn't do this on their own. They didn't resist the Egyptians. They didn't break free. God did this. And the reason why is because of His covenant, His promise. And so God has promised, and now He's keeping His word. And so we have to always remember this perspective, that we may not be the generation that inherits the promise, that we may be preparing for the next generation to inherit something, but we do the work and we're staying faithful and we're passing on the faith. But now this group's about to inherit the promise. And God is saying, and you're going to inherit some things you didn't earn. You didn't work for these things. You didn't build these cities and build these houses and dig these wells and plant these vineyards, and you're going to get all of this. And so we begin to see this concept of grace and understanding that there is grace. So many people, tragically, have this concept of the Old Covenant writings. And again, forgive my repetitious nature here, but we have to always remind that the Old Testament is not just those books from Genesis to Malachi. The Old Testament is a covenant that God made with Israel on Mount Sinai. But here we're seeing this concept of grace, and so many times people, and I'm going to use the vernacular, believe the Old Testament has no such thing as grace. And that's all you see from beginning to end is grace. I mean, in the beginning, we see two people who disobey God, and what does He do? He kills animals so that they can be clothed, and He takes care of them. Even their outcast son Cain, He gives him an element of grace, and God is patient with these people, and He works with them, and He has to destroy a whole bunch of them because they become so wicked. But even then, Noah finds the word favor. I believe the Hebrew word is hesed, which means grace in the eyes of God. And so we see this concept of grace all throughout the law and the prophets. God is a God of grace. This is not a wrathful, vengeful, mean-spirited, angry, just despotic God who just lashes out and just wipes people out because he just had a bad day. God is slow to anger. Wrath is called His strange work. In other words, it's something that's foreign to Him. And yet these people they're the inheritors of grace. And so God is giving them something that they did not attain, nor did they deserve it as well. And so think about it. God's been allowing the nations in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, to prepare all of this for His people. Now, these people are wicked, evil, horrible people, and God's going to deal with them. But He's been patient with them. For 400 years, He's been patient with them. They've known about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They've known there was this group of people who went to Egypt. They heard about Joseph, who saved so many of hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of people through his work there with, preparing for famine. They knew about Israel. Those kind of stories went everywhere. People talked, and these people would go and they'd trade and they'd go to different parts, and as they were going through, they talk about, over in Egypt, there's this group of people, and this is what happened to them. Because, that's what people did. They just sat around, they would talk, and they were very conversational. They would pass on the stories. These people knew of the one true God, and yet they still continued to reject Him and serve the false gods. And so God has been allowing them, out of His patience and love, but also He's been allowing them to stay there and to build these cities for His own people to come there and to take over. You think about what it would be like if these people would have shown up to a brand new land and there was nothing there. Just let that set in for a second. To go someplace where no one has settled before, And you've got to start out fresh. Is hard work. We watched a movie the other night, me and Kristen, and in it, there was this scene about the Oklahoma land rush back in the 1880s, and that was a strange event in our country where they just said to people, "Hey, come on out here to the Oklahoma territories, and we'll give you land. We'll give you a quarter section of land. You gotta go and you gotta get in a race, and we're gonna shoot the cannon off." And of course, that's where the concepts of boomers and Sooners, those who went before the cannon, a lot of them were shot and killed, they were called the Sooners. Those who went after the cannon, the boom, those were called the boomers. Well, they shot the cannon off and people took off and they planted their flag in the ground where there was these stakes that had already been surveyed out, and they got their quarter section of land to work the land. Many of those people failed. Many of them left. Because, it's not like, well, we're going to go over here to Tractor Supply and get a plow and buy a mule, and we're going to start farming the land, and we're going to buy fertilizer and seed. I mean, you can imagine how hard that was. And many, many people went bust and left. They went back to Kansas. They went to, back to Missouri. They may have gone on to, California. So, it was a tough thing. Well, these people don't have that. They show up and there's already fields. There's already wells that have been dug. There's already vineyards and olive groves and animals, and they just got to go in and take it, and God's going to give it to them. So this is a very unique thing. And so God is reminding them of His faithfulness, and that if they want to stay in the land, they must be faithful as well. But then He begins to exhort them. We see the exhortation. We saw the example of faithfulness. Now there's the exhortation of forgetfulness. Not to forget. Not to forget. Let's look at verse 12. So in your copy of Scripture, look at verse 12 here in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. Then beware. That's an ominous word. Beware. Someone says to you, beware. It's like you start looking around for someone who's trying to kill you. Beware. Lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Forgetfulness is a killer. It is. Forgetfulness destroys so many things that God wants for us. And so God is saying to His people, don't forget. When you get there and you go through the conquest and you begin to go into these cities, and all of a sudden you start settling down and you start reaping the grapes and planting and sowing in the fields that weren't yours, but they're already prepared for you, and you're living in somebody else's house that they built, and you start thinking, hey, this is a nice life. Look what all I've done. I was a pretty good warrior here, and I did all this on my own. And God's saying, no, don't do that. Don't forget me. Because if you do, terrible, tragic things are going to happen. And so God warns them. He says, beware of this killer that's lurking. It's called forgetfulness. Don't allow that into your heart. And so forgetfulness is the foundation of sin, and would be the foundation for them losing the land as well. And so you think about what we forget when we're dealing with God. We forget His goodness. Think of all the goodness that God has given to you in your life. And wouldn't it be a shame to not remember those things? It would be horrible not to remember all the things that God has done for you, just to forget about them, or start thinking that you did and taking credit for God's work. And God is telling them this, and you would think, there's no way. There's no way these people are going to forget what God has done for them, but they do. I mean, we come to the time of the judges, and it's just horrible wickedness, and those people just act like a bunch of renegade pagans. And so they forget God's goodness, they forget His law. And over in the book of Deuteronomy, God tells them, do not forget my law. Don't forget my commandments. Don't forget my statutes and my judgments. Don't forget. And also, don't forget the covenant. God is saying, look, I made this covenant with your forefathers, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I made it with them. But then when we come to Mount Sinai, I make a covenant with you. I made a covenant with Abraham to give him this land, and that's why you're getting the land, but now I've made a covenant with you that I'm going to be there with you, and I'm your God, and you're going to serve me, and I'm going to take care of you. And so we now have this covenant, which we, of course, call the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. But God is saying, look, don't forget the promise, this agreement that we have. Don't do that. And of course they do. They forget it and they break it, and it's terrible what happens. So there's this exhortation of forgetfulness. Don't do that. Then there's the expectation. I'm going to use a word here that you may not be familiar with, or you may be familiar, but you've not heard it in a long time, because it's an old, ancient word. The expectation of fealty. Fealty, F-E-A-L-T-Y, fealty. Well, what is fealty? Well, that's this ancient word that comes actually from the ancient time of kings and queens and knights and armies and castles and things like that, where if you pledged fealty to a king, you're saying, you are my king, I'm going to serve you. And so he would offer you protection. And so if you were in another part of the area and you were to come under him as a vassal, and I want your protection, I pledge fealty to you. And so if you call me to go to war, I'm going to war on your behalf. I'll defend this country because it's yours, and I've pledged myself to you. And so there is the expectation of fealty, and we see that in verse 13. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and you shall take oaths in his name. And so sometimes we think that oath taking is something that's bad. Well, God is saying, no, it's not bad. But if you're going to take an oath, if you're going to make an oath and make a promise, if you're going to make a contract, you do it in my name, and my name only. Not in anybody else's name, not any other God's names, but my name only. And so God is reminding them, look, I brought you out of the house of slavery, and I brought you here to worship me, and because of that, I expect fealty from you, that you're going to serve me. And so you've been brought out of the bondage under Pharaoh where you served him. Now you're going to serve me. I'm a much better king than Pharaoh was. And so freedom from Satan's bondage, that if you're a Christian, you've been set free from the bondage of sin and death and of Lucifer. But it doesn't mean that we're given complete autonomy and absolute freedom. No, we're under fealty to our King, and we must serve him, and we must do as he calls us to do. And whenever he gives us an order, we obey. And so this is what the Lord is calling them to do. Swearing, again, this is not, we're swearing, oaths are swearing not to forget God's goodness. Over in Deuteronomy 5:11. Verse 11, if you'll remember this commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Part of the vanity of taking his name in a terrible way is in a worthless way. And so if you were to make a contract using his name, say, I swear under Yahweh in his name, by his name, that I'm going to do this, and yet you've got no intention of doing that, you're using his name in vain. Because God expects you to keep your word. Because if you're going to invoke his name, then you ought to do what you say. Because you're one of his subjects. You serve him. And so there is the expectation of fealty. Just to kind of review, we see the example of faithfulness, verses 10 and 11. We see the exhortation of forgetfulness, not to forget, in verse 12. And then this expectation of fealty in verse 13. And so that's all about this. How do we remember God? We remember him through faithful service. But then we remember God through obedience. Obedience. Verses 14 through 19, we see God's calling them not just to be faithful in their service to him, but in obeying what he's called them to do. So, verses 14 and 15, God tells them to avoid the temptation of idolatry, of worshiping a false god, serving false gods, selling themselves into service to someone who's not even a god. And so avoid the temptation of idolatry. Look at verses 14 and 15. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people who are all around you. For the Lord your God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord your God be aroused against you and destroy you from the face of the earth. He can't make it any plainer. Don't do this. And if you do, you are going to arouse a terrible wrath in me. And I'm going to wipe you out if you do this. Don't be some backstabbing bunch of people who you start going after false gods. And don't insult me that way. After I've done all this for you and I've proved myself to you, don't be tempted to follow some false god. And so God is saying, remember your relationship. He's saying, I'm a jealous God. And so if he's jealous, means he's got a relationship with you. And so those he doesn't have a relationship with, he's not jealous of, because they belong to somebody else. But if you belong to him, well, there's an expectation of faithfulness, right? And you're going to obey. And you're going to keep your vows. And so you remember the relationship, because God is jealous. He's saying, and the reason why he's saying he's jealous is because he's saying we have this covenant, and I've formed this relationship with you. And I love you, and I want you to love me. And so I'm jealous. But they're also to remember their history. Their history is kind of checkered, isn't it? There's a whole bunch of people that died in the wilderness because of their sinfulness and stupidity. Part of their sinfulness was whenever Moses was actually on the very mountain of God, Sinai, Horeb, and he was receiving the law from God. What were the people doing? They were down there making a false god, dancing and celebrating and doing all kind of horrible, terrible, sinful things. And they were committing idolatry among other horrible sins whenever this was happening. And so God is saying, remember your history. Don't be like that. And if they'd have just thought, hey, there are people who aren't here today, who should have been here because of their disobedience, we buried them out there in the desert. We buried a whole bunch of them. Anybody who was 20 years old and older, they didn't make it. And so you would think these people wouldn't have to be reminded of their history, but God has to say, remember your history. Don't do this. And also remember the covenant. And so the covenant, this is going to be something you're going to hear continually, is this idea of covenant, because it's who God is. He makes a covenant with people, and he wants to keep his word, and he expects those people to keep words as well. And so idolatry in the eyes of God is the same as adultery. It'd be like, someone who's married and, at night, they like, you know what, hey, I'm going to go out, I'll leave that at home, and, I'm just going to go have a little fun. Nobody's going to know. You come back home, you pick it up, you put it back on, hey, no big deal. We're good, right? No, you didn't keep your covenant that you made with this person. It's called adultery. And that's how God sees it. It's something that's horrible and terrible. And so it's an insult to God to trade him, the most faithful being ever, and powerful being ever, and loving being, and graceful being, for a false god that doesn't even exist. If you go over to Isaiah, you just got a little time, just read chapters 43 and 44, where you see this concept that the prophet Isaiah gives the people about the stupidity, the idiocy, absolute lunacy of idolatry. And yet, they would do it over and over and over again. So how do we remember God through obedience? Well, avoid the temptation of idolatry. Number 2, avoid the temptation of skepticism. Skepticism? Well, okay. So yeah, let's look at this. Verse 16. Let me take a little sip here. You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him at Massah. Now, if you'll remember, our Lord Jesus actually quoted this verse whenever he is being tempted by Lucifer in the wilderness. You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him at Massah. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of history here about what Massah is. But there's an element of skepticism, of thinking, well, God's not around. Remember, Jesus is out in the wilderness. And no doubt Satan's trying to remind him, well, hey, you're by yourself. Do what you want to do, make some bread with, your powers, fall down and worship me, those kind of things. Let me, jump off the temple and, the Lord's going to catch you, So to understand this verse, we've got to go back to Exodus. So if you got your Bible, just flip a few books over. Exodus chapter 17. Exodus 17 and verse 7. So this is the rebellion at Massah. Verse 7. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, and listen to what they said, is the Lord among us or not? He's not here. He's not around. He's not here to help us. He's not here to hold us accountable. We can do what we want to do. God's not here. He didn't show up. Now, I may have mentioned this incident. If I did, forgive me for saying it again, but the 1855 earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and what it did, killed 12,000 people, and it started this tectonic movement spiritually in Europe, where all these people, these skeptics, came out and say, well, if God really loved us, he would not have allowed this to happen. Now, of course, the problem with that is we are really not very smart humans. We build our homes in terrible places. We'll build next to a volcano, then it erupts, and we get mad at God because the volcano erupted. We build our houses on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and then a hurricane comes along and tears up the place, and we think, well, why did God make that happen? He just doesn't like us. There is no God. And we forget that hurricanes have been hitting this place, well, since God made the world. It's part of the way that the hydrological cycle helps to cool the planet. But it's a terrible thing. Same with the cyclonic activity over, in the east. And then there's earthquakes. We live on a planet that's unstable. It's got these big things called tectonic plates that occasionally will move. And if they move, it creates this shaking. And anything that's built there in the epicenter is going to be damaged or destroyed. We do this, and yet we'll turn around and blame God when a tornado comes along or earthquake happens or a pandemic starts, and we forget we live on a dangerous place, we live in a sinful world, and yet we want to blame God for all of this. And we get skeptical. He's not among us. He didn't take care of us. He let this bad thing happen. Or we'll go a step further. He's not here. We can do what we want to do. There is no God. He's not going to hold us accountable for that. I mean, that whole, okay, maybe he is, kind of watching over. He's not concerned with little old me. He's concerned with big things and nations, but not the individual. And so there's this temptation to believe that either God isn't here and he doesn't care about us, or if he is here, he doesn't care about me, because he's too busy with big things. And he's not capable of focusing on the macro and the micro at the same time. And all that is not true. And so God reminds them about this thing that happened at Massah, where they start saying, well, God's not here. And they start complaining, and they're mad at because God doesn't love them, is what they thought. And it wasn't true. And so they tempted God, and his anger was aroused. And so God is saying, you shall not do that. In verse 16, don't tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. And then verses 17 and through 19 is where we're going to stop. And this is the remedy for tough times, because tough times are going to come. Even for God's choicest people, these people, tough times are going to come. Do you think that when they were taking over the land, that nobody was killed? Sure, there were people that died. They did, And then they got the land. There were people who died of sickness, and they were old people, and so life just goes on. And there were tough times, and they still had to struggle with all these things, you know. And it's easy to begin to think that, well, you know, God doesn't care about us. And the remedy for tough times is obedience. Listen to this. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, His testimonies, His statutes, which He commanded you. Verse 18. And you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with you, and that you may go in and possess the good land which the Lord God swore to your fathers, and cast out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord has spoken. Enemies. Yeah, there are going to be people there that they're going to try to kill them. And they're going to have to, you know, fight these people. And so tough times tend to challenge our obedience. But we're called to be obedient in the midst of tough times. Tough times sometimes brings out the worst in us, as it did the people of Meribah or Massah. You know, they complained. But tough times can also, for those who trust God, bring out the best. Where we're like, hey, I don't care what happens. I'm going to stay with God. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to obey Him. And then tough times are an opportunity for our faith to be displayed and to grow. 10 times the Lord showed Himself strong whenever He was about to bring the people out of Egypt, all the plagues. 10 times. They saw this. They had, you know, ringside seats. And then they get in the wilderness, and 10 times they were tested. 10 times. They had to face poisonous water, crossing the Red Sea, you know, not enough water, not enough food. 10 times, and they failed 10 times. The last one, of course, go in the land, spy it out, and they came back. This is a great land, but we can't take it. These people they're huge. They're going to kill us all. And they wouldn't trust the Lord. And so tough times are an opportunity for our faith to be displayed and to go and say, hey, I'm going to trust the Lord. I'm going to do what He calls me to do. I'm going to go where He says go. I'm going to obey Him. I don't care what comes my way. If I die, fine. I'm going to die being obedient to the Lord. So the remedy for tough times is obedience. And God just reminds them of this. You shall diligently. It means you're studying. This is something that is a focus of yours. It's a priority. You shall diligently keep the commandment of the Lord your God, His testimonies, His statutes, which He has commanded you. And you shall do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with you, and that you may go in and possess the good land which the Lord swore to your fathers, and to cast out all your enemies from before you, as the Lord has spoken. That's the remedy. There's going to be tough times, but hey, stay faithful. If you're faithful, God's going to continue to bless you, and He's going to continue to take care of you, even through tough times. Good times, you get all this stuff that you didn't even earn, grace, and even tough times, when the battles come, God will be there with you. Well, I hope you have a good night. I hope that the rest of your week is just wonderful and the Lord favors you, and I look forward to seeing you this coming Sunday on the Lord's Day. God bless. Have a good night.
Jesus, come. Let your grace fall like rain. Jesus, come. And flood our hearts again with your love. Holy risen one, Jesus, come. Jesus, come. For the prodigal that has gone away, for the traveler who's been led astray, for the one searching for the way, Jesus, come. For the blinded, deceived and confused, for the skeptics wanting to see the proof, for the ones needing to know the truth, Jesus, come. Jesus, come and let your grace fall like rain. Jesus, come, flood our hearts again with your love. Holy risen one, Jesus, come. Jesus, come. For the lonely hearts that struggle through the night, for the weary souls hanging on with all their might, for the ones longing for the life, Jesus, come. Jesus, come, let your grace fall like rain. Jesus, come and flood our hearts again with your love. Holy risen one, Jesus, come. Jesus, come. For the one searching for the way, needing to know the truth, for the ones longing for the life only found in you, Jesus, come. Jesus, come, let your grace fall like rain. Jesus, come and flood our hearts again with your love. Holy risen one, Jesus, come. Jesus, come.